Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Mail, a founding partner of the Advisory Board for the Arts, and I'm joined today by my colleague Karen Freeman, our Executive Director of Research. The Advisory Board is a membership organization, and on the call today, there are a wide variety of members and guests from all around the world. We are grateful to all of you for spending time with us. The topic for our conversation is Surviving a Shutdown, Lessons from Prior Closures. With the impact of closure while the impact of closure due to COVID is unprecedented, some arts leaders do have experience with closing for extended periods for natural disasters, financial issues, or labor problems. Our two guests today have plenty of experience on that front, and we are grateful that they have joined us. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, if you have a question at any time during the conversation, please type it into the chat box. You may send it to the entire group or direct it to Karen privately. Karen will keep track of all the questions, and later in our discussions, we'll ask our guests to respond to as many of those as possible. At this point, I think all of you are more than proficient Zoom users, but to make our call feel a little bit more like a community, please take a moment and enter your name and organization into the chat box so others can see who else is on the call. I think you'll see some familiar names and be pleasantly surprised by the wide variety of organizations joining us. One of the things that we love about this call is not only do we have guests from 3 different continents, but we are, of course, joined by representatives of every possible genre in the performing arts world. In addition, so as to better hear our guests, we have muted everybody's audio. Again, if you do have a question or comment at any time, please type it into the chat box. So let's get started. If there were a betting pool in the performing arts today, it would focus on 2 questions. First, when will you be permitted to open? And second, when you do, when will the audience actually come back? About a week or so ago, I was talking to one of our members who runs a regional theater. Like you, he spends his days looking at plans in different scenarios. And he told me that last month he was looking at 3 different scenarios. Now, a month later, what was his worst case scenario then is now his best case scenario today. From what we hear, organizations appear to be looking at 3 different options for resuming live performances. First is a limited opening sometime in the fall with a socially distanced audience, perhaps supplemented by streaming delivery. Second, a more robust opening either just before the holidays, particularly to get Nutcracker or Christmas Carol, or after the first of the year. The third option is abandoning the 2021 season entirely and looking towards summer or September of 2021. Of course, all these scenarios are dependent on the widespread availability of testing and a vaccine. But under all of these circumstances, your performance spaces will be closed for a minimum of 6 months if you go back to mid-March. Paul Hogel is the president and CEO of the Cleveland Institute of Music and formerly the executive vice president of the Detroit Symphony. Paige Price is producing artistic director of the Philadelphia Theater Company. Both Paige and Paul were part of organizations that closed their doors for between 6 and 9 months and later reopened successfully. We hope that their experiences will provide useful lessons for other leaders facing difficult decisions related to extended closure and eventual reopening. Our sincere thanks to both of you for joining us today. So Paige and Paul, could each of you briefly tell us about your background, starting with Paige?
I started as a performer. In fact, for a couple decades, I was a dancer, singer, actor, and ended up performing in every media, ultimately landing on Broadway for about a dozen years, which was thrilling. And then I moved into producing. I was always a labor leader as well. So I sort of had a well-rounded, I thought, look at the business. And I ended up in Aspen, Colorado, doing a play, and they were looking for new artistic leadership. And so asked me to help, and I gave them some names. And ultimately the short story is that I ended up being the artistic director in a new career that I had never even imagined, but really grew to just love. And so after about 9.5 years in Aspen, ended up in Philadelphia, and it sort of turnarounds that have become a little bit of my calling card. That's the short version.
Thanks, Paul.
Been in the symphony orchestra world for 30 years. Had the great privilege of working for the Chicago, Atlanta, Baltimore, and Detroit symphonies before coming to Cleveland, which is my home, in 2016, following a very complicated accreditation journey that the school went through in 2014. And I joined in 2016 and have been here for those 4 years.
Great. So let's talk about your experience running an organization that closed its doors. Paige, when you got to Philadelphia, you made the decision to cancel the 17-18 season. What did you hope to accomplish, and what did you do for the time that the theater was closed?
We had a little bit of structural debt to address, and we had some payables that had accrued. And so we had a sort of a three-pronged approach. One was to address the deficit, raise some cash to make that go away. We also wanted to look at restoring the organizational capacity and restore trust between staff, funders, vendors, board, artists, audiences. And I didn't do it alone. We had a board that was committed to doing that, as well as bringing in a new managing director at that time. And it was someone I had worked with in Aspen. So there was a group committed to sort of looking at the way we did business. And we wanted to relaunch a season free, or as free as we could get of that debt that was holding us back. And look at what it might mean to produce within our means and not count on and not have to dig out of holes at the end of every fiscal year. You know, what does that look like? Can we revise our projections so that they reflected a little bit more of reality? And so we just, you know, we got a shot at a new beginning, and so that's what we set out to do.
And during the time that the theater was closed, what your focus was obviously on raising money, but what else did you do?
We used it we called it an R&D gap year, and in the press we called it a festival-like season, which really meant that we presented a lot of different kinds of events just to keep the lights on. So we didn't go dark, but we wanted to, our goal was just to be net zero for what we were spending on marketing, and we tried to keep the building vibrant with different, you know, some with different with varying success, I would say. Some things looked like theater, some things absolutely did not. You know, we had a princess show that sold out, so there was that. But we basically just tried to keep the doors open as we addressed everything. And part of that R&D was meeting funders, going to see other theaters work. You know, I was new to the area, and there's 30 theaters in Center City, so how could we best look at our place and differentiate ourselves in that market? So getting to know what was out in the community was really important for me. So I went to a lot of theater at other organizations. The leadership at the company was really interested in what is our mission and how can we focus back in on what's going to differentiate us in this market.
Great. So Paul, the closure of the Detroit Symphony in 2010 was as a result of a labor stoppage. What were you and your colleagues doing during this period of closure? You're on mute.
Sorry. I would start by telling a funny story that I haven't told in quite a while. So I interviewed for the job in Detroit in the late winter of 2010. And every musician I interviewed with cautioned me to not buy a house because they knew the labor showdown was coming, and they really worried whether there would be a Detroit Symphony at the other side of it. So the strike happened on October 4th, 2010, and lasted until April 4th of 2011. I remember it vividly. The first thing I would share that we did, and I've brought this to Cleveland during this current time, is we spent a good portion of every day imagining what the return was going to be like. We viewed and I think Paige has put her finger on it, a really important thing. This is a team sport. It's a team process. We all have individual roles, of course, but being on a strong team is really important. We spent a lot of time focused on what the return would be like and how we could help our colleagues on stage, as well as the administration and the board, walk halfway across the bridge so that we could find a way to get back. A long protracted labor stoppage is like a very complicated chess game, and you can get lost in that chess match when at the end of the day you want music to return to your stage. The other thing, so that's a really important thing. The day we left our offices here in Cleveland, we asked a group of staff members to form a return committee so that they could have in them the energy and excitement and careful thinking about what a return sometime would be, because that's how you have a community. The other thing we did during the entire 6 months is we spent unending amount of time in what I would call as tabula rasa planning. We had a lot of sacred cows that everyone assumed could not be revisited. Things like where we gave concerts, what we charged for concerts, what our purpose and role were, what our relationship was with the community, what the governance structure of the board was like, how was the staff structured. All these things, for a period of time, we're willing to wipe the slate clean and just ask ourselves, what's in the best interest of returning music to serve the citizens of Detroit? And that's where we spent a lot of time. We were struck by how quickly the 6 months went by in terms of the quality of the planning, but how slowly it went by because it was so quiet.
So during your year hiatus, Paige, what was the most effective way you found to stay in touch with your various communities?
I have to say that was one of the areas that was very difficult. Other than being out in the community and getting to know the other arts leaders, I met with almost all of them. I met with anyone who would answer the phone, truthfully, and just tried to convey a sense of, trust is hard to build and it takes a long time. So getting out there and just listening and asking people what they thought of, what their perception of the company was very helpful. So it really was about how to approach it with a lot of humility and curiosity, and to not come out with, this is what I think the company needs to be. So we did some newsletters. I dealt with a lot of patrons who were not happy. When we did go semi-dark for the year, it was not popular. So I had a lot of work to do. We did surveys, and I literally myself reached out to anyone who responded to a survey just to have the opportunity to talk to them and find out why, what moved them to respond, even if it was a positive thing. So there was, on the upside, there was a lot of people that had been subscribers for 20 plus years. So I found the pocket of people who were loyal and who were just scared that we were going to go away or become something that they weren't familiar with. So it was a lot of time. One of the staff people I remember saying, when I met with a high school student, she said, "Do you ever say no?" And I just didn't, because I couldn't.
So Paul, obviously work stoppages and orchestras are highly emotional. Everybody takes sides. How did you effectively communicate with your communities without inflaming the already inflamed situation?
I love Paige's attitude. If somebody was interested in meeting, whether they were a student or a veteran of our organization, we would meet with them. And so that kind of spirit, I think, is contagious. We did a lot of in-person meetings in a lot of locations. Not possible today, of course, but at the time, we would convene ticket buyers, volunteers, trustees, of course. If there was an occasion to gather people, we would gather them and answer their questions. We had a pre-scripted set of points we wanted delivery, but mostly it was answering questions. We were meticulous in making the rounds with our large institutional funders, because strikes put real pressure on individual people, because in the end, donors get named and drugged through the press, and it's just really, really hard that way. we spent a lot of time in the care and feeding of our team, our professional administrative team, which is something I learned there and I'm doing here in Cleveland. We have every other week full staff video calls in which we have really great attendance, and we've been really transparent with them. We've talked to them about what the issues are, as we did in the Detroit situation. So I think there's a fork in the road, and I'm sure some leaders would hole up in their office, rely on the communications team to get the messages out and just assume that they can weather the storm. The Detroit approach, and the genius of Ann Parsons, for whom I worked, is that she would relate and interact with anyone. I would close this question, Michael, by saying that it's good to understand your roles and your temperament. Ann is a beloved, likable, charming, sincere person. And in a strike mode, my job was to be kind of the assistant principal. I was the bulldog. I took all the press blows. I read all the social media. She read none of it. And to this day, it's still kind of scarred in my soul. It's worn a little bit, but that's a good splitting of the duties. Everybody can't go through that together, and she is so good at that, and I did what I thought I was good at. So
Fair enough.
Michael,
So
if I could, one other thing that we did for our subscribers or people that were cynical about coming back is that early in the season that we were dark, we presented a night called See and Be Seen, and we put 8 scenes up from shows that we were thinking about for the next year. We wanted to shine a light on the work that we were doing to get back to normal, and they came into the theater, watched these scenes, and were able to have a conversation afterward, which was very helpful. I learned a lot from that method, and now we do it every year. People look forward to gaming what we're going to plan.
it's a great idea.
So one of the things that always struck me during my time running arts organizations is it doesn't matter what role you have, the focus of the organization is ultimately what happens on stage. And the performance is really what drives it. So Paul, you had 6 months without performances. How did you maintain the focus of the organization during that period when there were no concerts?
Well, we started almost every meeting by talking about something music related, but I don't want to misrepresent. It was quiet, and I think it was that vacuum of sound, that absence of sound, that caused us every day to work harder to try to return it to the stage. I have an interesting observation that I don't know how to even test it or have it be analyzed, Michael, but I hear our patrons, particularly at the school, talk about returning to coming to concerts and even if it's just a handful of us in the hall. And I'm really wondering if they mean that, because the first concert for Detroit back in the hall, obviously standing room only, webcast worldwide, was powerful because the stage was full of the musicians we love, and the audience was full of our friends, family, neighbors, the people whom we want to experience that together. So are we really going to enjoy sitting in Severance Hall in Cleveland with 30 people when the Great Cleveland Orchestra plays Beethoven 7? Maybe the first time, but I don't think that's what, I think this will give us an interesting opportunity to explore whether it's exclusively the horizontal relationship or the vertical relationship with each other, or the horizontal relationship with the stage. And I suggest to you that it's both. And without both, sitting at a computer screen, staring at a production, a theater production, a musical production, it's great to kind of warm our hearts, but it's not the experience. So anyway, that was a long answer.
So Paige, I'm interested. You obviously thought a lot during your quiet year about what it would look like when you reopened. How did you plan for reopening? Paul said that was something they talk about now at the Cleveland Institute every day. But how in Philadelphia, how did you think about reopening during your quiet year? What were the most important considerations to you? What actions did you take?
Part of the initial contraction meant that we did not have jobs for people. We had to let go a dozen people in the first contraction. We did it with dignity, and we just said that their jobs were being eliminated, but that is a really hard thing to come back from. And the people that stay, we talked very transparently about how this is going to be very uncomfortable. It's just changes very hard and very uncomfortable. And we said that for those that didn't want to go through that, we would try to help place them somewhere, just because it's going to be hard. So what happened in the planning of the next year is that the pieces fell into place for the people who would be on the team to do that kind of work. And we were saying that we weren't going to produce the same way, that we were open to all the methodologies that were coming to us. And so another round of staff changes happened because some people just couldn't look toward another model or other ways of doing things. And so the most exciting thing that happened during that year is that we put our team together for the future, and we had a lot more, I would say, institutional experience for what the theater industry could provide, and that was not mostly locally sourced, but we got just another team in place that had a sense of what the industry was doing, which I thought was exciting when you're trying to look for opportunities to do things differently.
So did you plan events? I mean, the site, obviously reorienting the team is critical, but in terms of your season, in terms of communicating, how did you plan for reopening? What was the message that you got across?
We sourced our artists more locally as well, so that there was an investment. I think their first show was the biggest, had the biggest audiences, and it's the curiosity factor. I'm sure people were curious about what we were going to do. It was an exquisite play too. I mean, Sweat was a very PTC play, and people were eager to see it, and was stocked with local artists. We went and planned way too many events, if I'm honest, right? So you do all the donor events, come see behind the scenes, do a tour. A lot of people don't care about that stuff anymore. They just don't. But we provided it, and we had a couple designer, behind the scenes things that actually were well attended. But we just invited them to almost everything.
And Paul talked about in Detroit questioning every assumption and really looking at the way you did business. As part of your reopening, did you, obviously with a new staff, it'd be perhaps a little easier. How did you think about your core assumptions that you inherited?
Well, during the time of the strike was when we developed the entire neighborhood series scenario, which would take, at the time, 24 of the subscription concerts out of Orchestra Hall downtown into 6 different neighborhoods across Southeast Michigan. And that was major change, because part of an orchestra, particularly an elite level orchestra's sonic signature, is its concert hall. And Detroit has a really great concert hall. But when we convinced ourselves that building an audience, expanding the fan base for the Detroit Symphony was more important because we needed a larger fan base, then the decision became easy. At the same time, it was the last few days of negotiation with the orchestra was when the idea came to bargain for webcasting all the concerts. And at the time, I remember the colleague who walked in, he worked for me, and he says, we should go for this and put it on the table that we want to reach a deal to live webcast every concert and save them in a library for a period of time that can be broadcast. And no one was doing it in the US, only the Berlin Philharmonic. And I remember the last decision when it was finally agreed to, somebody on the musicians bargaining committee looked at us and said, fine, whatever, you'll never do it. And that was 1 million viewers later. And it's a different perspective. It's not the same as sitting in the hall for sure, but it is a different addition. And like Paige, I don't know if we planned too many things, but we planned a lot of things for the return. So I'm smiling and commiserating with we got to the buffet bar of ideas, and they all looked good when we signed on.
So looking back on those reopening events now for each of you, which ones were actually, or the reopening plans, which ones were actually of that buffet were the most effective? Which were the most nutritious?
Paige, you start.
I was just going to toss it to you. booze and food are very good draws, if I'm honest. But mostly they want to see the shows. They want to see the shows. The CNBC event that I talked about was very popular and has become a thing, among the most loyal. But they just want you to do your work.
Yeah.
Paul?
So a couple things. This is where our psychology hat comes in handy. Maybe this will make you laugh, Paige. The staff had different needs than the audience did, and the orchestra members had different needs than all those two other groups. The staff's basic psychology, like right now, my staff is fear. They are worried because they see things going on around them in other universities and other performing organizations that are just devastating in our little world. And that's what was happening in Detroit at the same time. So they needed, in Detroit, the staff needed to hear from the executives what the plan was, how the survival was, because we'd lost an entire season. No subscription season, no subscriptions had been sold, no summer season planned. And orchestras are really heavy personnel contract. The orchestra contract gets paid regardless of whether you have the money. So that was for the staff. The orchestra needed to be honored, as they needed to come on stage and to receive the full and due respect that they were owed. And so Leonard Slatkin, in his genius, asked them to come on European style, which means with the stage completely empty, when the concert's to start, they come out as a unit, rather than, normally when an orchestra all warms up and then it gets quiet and everybody looks. It's just, it was meant to respect them. And then Paige is exactly right. The audience needed to hear music. They needed to hear music that they loved, by the people that they loved, in the place that they loved. And you surround that with booze and food, and I think it's a nice night.
Paul, the inverse of that could also be, for us, it was the staff needed to succeed at something. That first year of not doing what we did was very dark for them. And so we reimagined our gala and turned it into a competition. I stole the idea from Aspen Santa Fe Ballet, who had this fantastic dance competition where their dancers joined with people from the community, and they know I stole it. And so we did ours, was sort of a So You Think You Can Act, and we set it up like a boxing ring, and it was called Play Brawl, and we chose very famous scenes, and we had professional actors with members of the community, and it was just a whole different kind of event. It was very successful and lots of fun, and it focused on the kind of work we did. So the business leaders got a sense of what we do. They were on our stage. So that's been another win for us. And that was something that we developed together.
So two more questions, and we'll open it up to our audience, which I think are probably the ones that people on this call would like to know most about. And that is lessons learned. And so, Paul, how do you apply lessons from 2010 to the current crisis?
Well, the discipline of making, that's not the right word I want to use. The discipline of making use of the time is a lesson that I have carried forward to today. A 6-month silence, when there were many, many weeks in which you weren't sure you were making progress in your negotiations, and in fact, we weren't making progress, can fly by. And I hope history will say that in that 6 months in which our colleagues on stage were suffering and bargaining for stuff that they genuinely believed in and had a right to, I hope history will say that the DSO reinvented itself, true to itself, but has come out for a decade really strong. It's easy for the time to fly. I cannot believe it's been 2.5 months since I've been in this. I'm back at school today, but since I've been in this building, and I work every day from that lesson to make sure that we're putting serious plans, getting a lot of input to those plans, both locally and nationally. I smiled when Paige said that too, because in Detroit, we brought in a lot of outside advisors during the 6 months. And the last thing I would say, lessons learned, and I'm just thankful every day I got to work for Anne as long as I did. I learned this issue of fear in your employees, and you can be afraid too, but it helps so much for you to be hopeful and completely transparent with them. I told our faculty and staff a month ago, here are the 3 things that you need to understand in terms of our progress, blah, blah, blah. That you don't have to walk around at home fearful that what you see at the other universities or at the Cleveland Orchestra is coming for you. You watch and I analyze these and I say, here's what we're going to say. In a month, we're going to come and talk about our first lever. And here's the extent of what it could be. And they're all pretty low key. I learned that from the Detroit situation, that employees whose livelihoods, whose lives depend on our leadership, just give them the information and some time to process it. So those are 2 things I learned.
So Paige, what lessons did you learn from your closure that are helping you with the current crisis?
Similar to Paul, it was creating the future with your staff. When I first got there, we passed out to every staff member the 8 pages of single-spaced payables that were due, so that they could see who we owed money to. These are people. These are artists. This is what we can. This is part of the healing that we, if we succeed, will convey upon the industry, right? So when we did retire that, everybody felt like they had participated in getting through that milestone. And we have our staff is furloughed at the moment, but we have weekly meetings and we just talk about, the leadership brings to them, okay, here are the assumptions that we had last week. This week, here are the assumptions, and that's what's guiding our movement forward. And the first 2 meetings we had were just social, and they were kind of painful, right? So everyone's talking about, what are you drinking? What are you drinking? And it was not very, we didn't want to, because they were on furlough, we didn't want to make them work, but really they want to talk about the company. They want to talk about what we're going to do and what we're doing and what's happening and where are we in the PPP process. So once we sort of took the lid off of, tell us what you're thinking and how you're feeling, it made for a much better conversation. So that transparency, you can't, it's golden. And the other thing that we learned was having the staff participate in the organizational infrastructure. So if you come into a place where the handbooks are out of date and there's no code of ethics, there's no, the bylaws are out of date, it's surprising how important that stuff is. So if you can concurrently do the housekeeping and have the staff participate in that, we had a great day with an organizational psychologist who got the staff on the same page. And it was night and day when we developed our values together.
So my last question before we open it up, Paige, start with you. Looking back at that time, is there anything that you would have done differently? And as importantly, is there any advice that you wish someone had given you at the time?
In the theater industry, there's been a huge shift in leadership. And right after I took my new job, all this great writing came out by David Doward and a lot of experts on transition. And I wish I had some of that reading. William Bridges there was just so much reading to do about how leadership transitions are, the responsibility is a shared one. And I think a lot of the effort that goes into a hire is what organizations focus on. But truly, there's a period after which a leader comes in whereby everybody needs to participate in that transition. And I don't think that is taken seriously, or I just don't think that's thought about as much as getting that new person, because that 3-year period after is going to be difficult. There's going to be attrition, there's going to be dissatisfaction. And so I think I wish I knew that to ask for that kind of support and identify what that actually meant. You can say you need support, but what does that actually mean in hard terms?
And Paul, anything you would have done differently in Detroit? Any advice you wish that someone had given you? Whether you would have listened or not, I don't know, but at least.
I think you, to that last point, I know you're just trying to be funny, but I think you don't listen to things at your own peril. But it's easy in a labor stoppage to start thinking in generalizations rather than about people. So you think about the bargaining unit, or you think about the concept that you're trying to achieve or understand it from the other side. The best advice that Anne kept saying over and over and over again, and I'm not sure it ever completely sunk in, is that we have to help our colleagues on stage cross a bridge that they don't know how to build. That's the way she framed it. And I tended to think of it as a unit, as a problem to solve, as something to solve for, because partly because I had just gotten there and I didn't know any of the orchestra members. So this wasn't personal to me. When they called her names and said she was horrible and all these things, I'm like, well, that's not the Ann Parsons I know. So I took up the shield and started swinging. But the lesson I learned that I would approach differently and have approached differently later in life now is that how deeply personal things like that are. Now, that's not what we're facing here, but in a labor situation, that is exactly what you're facing, is a group of individuals with whom we have to continue to work and want to work.
So Karen, I know I've seen a lot of great questions come by. Are there a couple that we've got time for some? Would you like to pass them on to our guests?
Sure. I think one theme of questions we've gotten is just about the financial impact of this and the impact on loyalty of having been in an extended period of shutdown. So the sub questions were around, subscription audience, what happened there, contributed revenue, what happened there. Maybe you can give us the high level about the impact that this had on both of those. Paul, do you want to start?
Sure. So first of all, an overall statement: you cannot harvest what you have not planted. And the great story about Detroit during the strike, other than the success that they have earned since then, is that we actually met our fundraising goal while the orchestra was on strike. Except for the annual gala, we met our fundraising goal. The subscription ended up being 2/3 of the subscribers, and this is 10,000 subscribers, let their ticket money that they had already paid for fully a year in advance stay with the organization because they believed that there was something at the other end of this in which they would return and want their tickets. That's a testament to the patrons and to decades of a love affair between that institution and that community. So when I say you can't harvest what you haven't sown, I'm finding right now, no one who doesn't have a relationship with CIM wants to talk to me about a contribution. All of our patrons who have a rich history do, and they're willing to spend hours talking to me about it. So for Detroit that year, and that's not an unusual story when you're not paying the most expensive and the real reason you exist, their wages, and you can meet your fundraising goals, you will be in a better financial shape. Of course, that doesn't make any sense, but Paige, what about you guys?
We were in a trickier place. There had been a diminution of support and subscribers over the 5 years prior. And so when we changed the season out and had a spectacularly failed membership program, I mean, that's my best failure, I'm pretty sure. We lost almost all our subscribers. I think we had 300 people that were like, okay, I'll be a subscriber and a member. They hated it with a vehemence that was unleashed upon me. I just, wow. So we had to rebuild by doing. So we had to just wait it out, and we contracted as much as we could. And the first year back, we saw about half of the subscribers. This year, the subscriber level is back to the 2014 level, which is a big, big leap for us. So we just had to grow it back a little bit. But yeah, the financials were bleak. They were just bleak. And to be honest, when we went dark, we had promised our previous subscribers that we are holding your seat for you. Your exact J101 and J102 are yours, Martha. But we cut our pricing, 50% value. And then last year we went to 40%. And this year we had no pushback. And so we were going to go back to 30%, which is the traditional subscriber discount, but now we can't do that next year. We're just going to stay at 40 and just see who we can keep. But yeah, it was a big fail.
And actually, there was a follow-on question related to that as you were talking about transparency page with your with the staff. There was a question around, leadership cuts versus otherwise, or was there transparency about where the pain was being felt? And was that an important part of your communication, or was that not as important as some of the other transparency that you did?
Do you mean during this current time and during the furloughs? The prior time. We didn't really cut anyone's salary during the first time. We had just eliminated roles, but in fact, we invested in more professional development. Some people got raises. Some people, we said, if you're going to be on board with this, we're going to send you to that conference. And so they had, many of them had not been to conferences ever. So we told them we were going to invest in them, but for that, we expected them to really be on board with what we were trying to accomplish.
There's a question that just came through. I'm going to pull it to the top because I think it's a great one for both of you. Is around the innovation or idea that emerged from your organization's work stoppage that ended up sticking around beyond that. Paige, I know you talked about the gala change that you made and having a big success there. So maybe Paul, we'll start with you, and then if there are other examples from Paige, it would be great to hear as well.
So everyone we pursued 10 years ago is still happening in Detroit, and they've made it better and better. And the litany would include the neighborhood subscription series all across Southeast Michigan, the live webcasting of every week's classical concerts, the slashing of the cost of a ticket. They went from the normal 15 price code distribution to 4 price codes back to a 1999 pricing level. An expanded education and community engagement program, which has now gone to a next level since we've left. What else? They were long ago doing their African American fellowship, but they've doubled down on their investment in that. So when I watch Detroit, which is only 30 hours away from me, I look with tremendous pride of what they're doing, because they've taken some good ideas and made them even stronger.
I don't have too much more to add other than we are reintroducing the membership. We're going to try it again. But it's framed in a little bit of different way. It's sort of like, we know you might not know what to do right now either. We don't know either. But if you want to stay connected to us, it's attached to tickets, and it's $10 a month. And it's for those who are not quite ready to buy a subscription, but who want to stay connected.
That's great.
So Paul, I know this is just slightly off the topic, but you've talked a lot about this streaming initiative and Detroit Symphony being the most accessible orchestra on the planet, all concerts available streaming for free. Obviously, streaming has had a huge impact in arts availability over the last 2 months. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about free versus charged available, the impact that Detroit has seen or not seen in terms of making streaming availability and the impact of people in live performances. If you could just talk a little about that, I think it's a topic of some interest to people.
Yeah. And I just want to make sure I'm careful to say this is completely my opinion. I don't speak for anyone other than myself on this. Last week, I surveyed the first 600 accounts in my email and asked them if they had watched any online classical music during the shutdowns, and if so, what the average length of time was. 2/3 had watched something of meaningful length, and the average length of time was longer than an hour. So this is what I'm experiencing with our own patrons. They do enjoy watching things online. They're watching it in enough volume, which I think is interesting. But when asked further, would they pay for it? The answer was almost unanimously no. So I did a recent interview where somebody asked me this question, and I think the issue of monetization of online concerts, theater productions, exhibits, I just don't see a pathway. The Berlin Philharmonic is the industry space leader in this, in the orchestra world. And they have spent years, decades now, building a digital audience for their product. But they're the only one on the planet that has done that. Detroit has a huge online audience. It is all free, and you can get access to their library with a $50, or at least I should check that, but it was a $50 donation, which is nothing. I buy it so I can share it sometimes with our students here. So I don't have any magical answer for anybody about this. I always perceived that the live webcasts in Detroit were an opportunity to expand our audience, because on any day there could be 2,000 people in Orchestra Hall, but there could be 20,000 people online around the world. That's just expanding. And it was a brand extender, but a revenue source, I never saw it, and maybe it will be in time, but I just don't see it now.
So Karen, you have a couple more questions?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a question around how both of you marketed your return, right? This opportunity for Triumph. And I know, Paul, you talked about the opportunity to recognize the orchestra, but how about behind the scenes or in the communication with existing or new audiences? How did you market your?
About 4 months into the strike, when we believed that the end was over the horizon coming, in a conference room one day, we invented the phrase that we needed to be a community-supported orchestra. So we had these two driving vision concepts in coexisting. The one was the most accessible orchestra on the planet, which Ross Binney, the marketing director at the Cleveland Orchestra, came up with. And the other was that we were going to be a community-supported orchestra, because we thought these two coexisted, and they flooded through every amount of material that we used to come back. And every time we did something, we would ask ourselves, are we being accessible? And if we matched it with what is needed to be community supported? Because as I famously said to the press in Detroit, it's fun to write letters to the editor and complain about how bad the management is, but when you're not a ticket buyer or a donor, it's not helping the cause. And I said that over and over and over again, but we had to earn that support. So when the program came back, everything was about accessibility. We're going to your neighborhoods. We're going to be online worldwide. We're going to be your ambassador. We're going to tell Detroit stories online, all those things.
Great. How about Paige?
We struggled, if I'm honest. We struggled. I'm not sure we had the right staff configuration for a big marketing blitz. We did hire press people, and so we got a lot more. We got a lot of ink about what we were doing to build up confidence in, mostly in our financial stability, because I think that people had worried about that, and so some people were in a wait and see stance that wasn't helpful to us. So getting the marketing out there about what we were doing. We had a limited budget, again, that was constraining to us. And I think that is something that we've gotten better at, but the first year was a little rough. One thing we got a lot of notoriety for was an open letter about complaining about our programming, not being progressive enough. And in fact, it came at a time when we were doing a new play, a brand new play. So which was by a non-binary person of color, featuring a whole cast of color. I mean, it was a tone-deaf time to actually drop this letter, but it resonated among the community and unleashed a sort of emotional component that we were not expecting. The upside was that anyone who knew the company, or that was, those donors and those subscribers, coalesced around us, as did the staff after initially feeling attacked. And in fact, we didn't disagree with anything the letter writers really said. It was the methodology, but that was actually a defining moment in our history. And when I would read articles about it in the press, because they loved it, the comments that you would read, who were our people, were very, they stood up for us. So, that was our press, that was our big hit for the year.
I didn't need to spend a cent in Detroit, because when you bear the city's name and you're the big orchestra, and you have 2 classical music critics and a huge public radio station and AM drive time radio that loved the orchestra, all we had to do is make ourselves available, and we got covered all the time.
One more, Karen?
Sure. Yeah, there's a question around how you think about cutting, especially in this environment, but based on your experience in the past, right? Are you cutting early to conserve, or cutting a bit of a time at a time to preserve relationships, right? Are you trying to keep the the cash flow so that you have something to do with it later versus waiting, spending it slowly so that you can preserve relationships, which was a big theme of what you've talked about. So any thoughts on that one?
Well, I can tell you what we're doing right now, then Paige can give a better answer. First of all, you have to understand your situation thoroughly, because what I'm experiencing here or what we experienced in Detroit, completely different. We use the tool of having multi-year planning budgets. So we had an idea what 5 years would look like. And we had an idea if we changed something today on enrollment or tuition, or at the time, orchestra compensation, how that played out over 5 years. I have taken the tact with our employees of being very straightforward about what could happen and to what degrees and when. But I don't think we have not opted to do kind of, we'll do this and see how that works and do that and see how that works. We've said there are 2 levers. The first lever has virtually no pain, a pay freeze and a hiring freeze. Everybody's like, whoosh, thank goodness. But lever 2, which I've listed, cuts, layoffs, dropping of benefits, restructuring of programs. If that comes, it's going to come on the last week of August, and I'm going to give you an advance notice. So, and we did this in Detroit. We're very straightforward with people. So what'd you do, Paige?
We took the pain up front. We talked to the staff about it and just said, this is our plan. We're going to apply for PPP funding. We will, so we furloughed everyone except the 2 leaders who took pay cuts. And we said, because the unemployment is so generous right now, we actually asked their opinions, what would you want to do? And they all said, we want the unemployment, but we want to be able to check our email and work as and we said, you can't do that. That's actually not an option. But on our weekly calls now, we do talk about what it looks like to come back and what it looks like to come back if we do get this funding and have not really work to do. So those are the conversations we're having right now. But I believe that save your chestnuts for when you can get back to operation.
Yep.
Okay. All right, well, as we close, I want to offer our sincere thanks to both Paige and Paul. Thank you, both of you, so much for being with us and for sharing your insights from your experience during your most recent closures and how that affects the way you look at closure today. Just a quick note to all of you that by joining us today, you will receive a summary of today's discussion, as well as notification of future webinars in our ABA Live series. This is an ongoing series, and so look for information in the newsletter about the next webinar. And finally, I want to mention ABA's Arts Resilience Center. The center is a major initiative by the Advisory Board for the Arts to provide support to our members, as well as to the broader arts community during this time of enormous uncertainty and unprecedented crisis. After we conclude today's conversation, please visit our website, advisoryboardarts.com. There on our homepage, you will see a link to the Arts Resilience Center. The center contains a wide variety of resources, including recordings of prior webinars, and of course, this one will be available shortly. We'd love your feedback, so if you can, please take a moment to fill out the poll on your screen. You see it there, so we want your feedback. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for taking the time to share your thoughts. We'll hold the poll open for another moment. So in the meantime, let me thank Paige, Karen, and Paul, and everyone on this call for joining us. We wish you well, be well, stay safe, stay sane, and remain hopeful. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.